Hi there, Lee from Rock Tours of London. Today we're off to a house in Richmond in southwest London. It's called The Wick, and we're going to be finding out why it's one of the great rock and roll houses. So this is it, the house. It's at the top of Richmond Hill, really close to Richmond Park, and the views out of the back of the house look across this lovely bend on the River Thames, absolutely gorgeous. So across 4 or 5 stories, I think, about 20 rooms, and what I'm going to do is try and get as much rock and roll into the house as I possibly can, and it's mostly across about a 4-year period, 1971 to 1975. The house was built in 1775, but it's in 1956 that things start to kick off, because that's when the actor John Mills buys the house. Him and his wife Mary Hayley Bell. By 1959, she'd had a novel published called Whistle Down the Wind. The novel was inspired by the sound of the wind that used to whistle around the house. And you might be thinking, well, I wonder what that sounds like. Well, it sounds exactly like this. In 1961, the book was turned into a film, and it starred their teenage daughter, Hayley Mills. It was in 1973 that Hayley Mills had a son called Crispian Mills, and in the late 80s he started a band in London called Kula Shaker. They went on to have quite a few hits in the mid-90s, Govinda and Tatvar. Their album was called K. But by 1971, Ronnie Wood and his wife Chrissy were looking for somewhere to live, and they stumbled across The Wick. It was they were selling a place in Kingston, which is just sort of 2 or 3 miles down the river, and they sold that for £28,000, went to the bank, borrowed the rest, and bought the house from John Mills for £100,000. At the time, there was at the bottom of the garden, there was a little cottage that was available for sale as well for £40,000. They didn't have any money left, so what they did is they had a chat with their friend and Faces bass player, Ronnie Lane. So he got it together and he bought the cottage. So by the end of 1971, Ronnie Wood and Ronnie Lane were both Faces and next door neighbours. So the Faces at the time, well, they were flying. Nod's As Good As a Wink album, which had Stay With Me and Debris, and then Ooh La La album, which had Cindy Incidentally, which incidentally was written by the 2 Ronnies. One of the first things that Ronnie Wood did in 1972 was he built a recording studio in the basement of the house. But then we've got our first big rock happening. That's in 1973, and it's the Eric Clapton Rainbow concert. What happened was Pete Townshend reached out to his friend Eric Clapton, who was having a really bad time. He was kind of strung out on heroin and had been pretty invisible actually since the end of Derek and the Dominos in 1970. The only time we'd seen him really was at George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh in 1971. So Pete Townshend's idea was to put a band of superstar musicians together. The reason it's connected to The Wick is because the rehearsals for this Rainbow concert were at The Wick in the basement there. And the musicians then that we can put into the house, well, Eric and Pete, of course. Ronnie Wood was on guitar. The main reason that Eric Clapton agreed to do this was, though, that Pete Townshend had got Steve Winwood involved. Steve Winwood had been in Blind Faith with Eric Clapton, and Eric felt very comfortable around him, and he gave him the confidence to accept the invitation to do this show. And alongside Rick Gretsch was the bass player from Blind Faith as well, and another old Traffic mate there, Jim Capaldi, on drums. And it must have worked, because by the following year, 1974, Eric Clapton he was in Florida making a new album, 461 Ocean Boulevard, and from there I Shot the Sheriff, and he was kind of back on track. By 1973, though, Ronnie Lane had quit the Faces, and he also quit the cottage, and he moved from London to the peace and quiet of Wales. He did, though, write How Come. That was one of the last things he did before he left London. The Faces carried on. They replaced Ronnie Lane with the Japanese bass player Tetsuya Yamauchi, and it was Tetsuya Yamauchi that had followed, when Andy Fraser had quit Free in 1972, he kind of stepped into Free right at the end of them being together, and their Heartbreaker album was the last one that they did together. He was on that, but now Tetsuya Yamauchi's in the Faces. Keith Richards is on the scene. What happened was, Ronnie's wife Chrissy was out at a club in London called Tramps, one of the main kind of musician members clubs, along with others like the Speakeasy and the Scotch of St James and the Bag of Nails. She was at Tramps and she bumped into Keith Richards. She could see that Keith was having a really bad time. I think he was a bit fed up, and she said, "Look, if you're having a hard time, why don't you come back to The Wick? Come back and see Ronnie. He's thinking about doing a solo album. Come back." So he did, Keith Keith Richards ended up staying at the Wick for, well, quite a while. Depends on whose book you rely on most. In Ronnie Wood's book, he said it was about 4 months. In Keith's book, it was a little bit less. Either way, Keith is now at Ronnie's. He's supposed to be in the cottage, but he seemed to be spending most of his time in the house. So by 1974, Rod Stewart's solo career is starting to really kick off, and Ronnie Wood's thinking, well, you know, and he's lost his Ronnie Lane, of course, who's now in Wales. So he's starting to think, well, maybe I should do my own thing. And he did. He went on to record his first solo album. It was called I've Got My Own Album to Do, and it was recorded in the basement studio. This means that we can put a few musicians in the house. We've got George Harrison. George and Ronnie, very good friends at this point. Ronnie was often over at George's place, and again, all the way down the river in Friar Park in Aylesbury. That's George there in the ponds at Friar Park. They wrote a song together at the time called Far East Man, which ended up both on Ronnie's album and on George's next album, Dark Horse. Also on the album, well, we've got Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. This was in the kind of just after Goat's Head Soup. David Bowie on backing vocals. That was around Diamond Dogs time for him. Mick Taylor, Stones guitarist. Not for much longer though. Mick Taylor was about to quit. He quit at the end of this year, 1974. George Harrison. And we've got two faces. We've got Rod Stewart and the Faces keyboard player, and Small Faces before that, Ian McLagan. Then two session players. We've got Willie Weeks, who had played with Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder, and he'd been on Donny Hathaway's Extension of a Man. And the drummer Andy Newmark. Andy Newmark had just kind of quit Sly and the Family Stone at the time, and he was a session player. He was playing with David Bowie, and later on he went on to play on John Lennon's Double Fantasy album in 1980. Now it's a song we all know. It's only rock and roll. What happened was, well, Keith Richards, who was still staying in the cottage down the bottom of the garden, he wandered up one afternoon up to the house into the basement, and there was Mick Jagger and David Bowie working on a song, and the song was called It's Only Rock and Roll. And Keith Richards is like a little bit, he gets a bit territorial with Mick working with David Bowie, and he's like, well, you know, and he loves the song, and he's thinking, well, why are you going to share this with David Bowie? He says, you know, so once he'd heard enough of it, he had a quiet word with Mick Jagger and said, look, you know, I think we should take this back for the Stones. This is the demo, so let's hear it. So Keith Moon and Ringo Starr, and also Paul and Linda McCartney were around quite a bit at the time. They were, I guess this is after Red Rose Speedway, Band on the Run, that kind of period for them. I think Paul and Linda it was mostly socialising, but there's also a chance that they did some mixing on in Ronnie's studio. A new name and a new face, it's Tony Sanchez. In the middle here, Tony Sanchez was Keith Richards' minder and personal pharmacist for most of the 70s. So wherever Keith was, Tony Sanchez wasn't really far behind. That's Keith's partner on the left there, that's Anita Pallenberg. Now this is a set of Polaroids that were sold at auction at Christie's in 2013 for £1,000. On the top row there, we've got Mick Jagger and Ronnie Wood, that fourth from the left, and another Mick Jagger and Ronnie Wood in the middle there, right in the middle. And on the middle right there, that's a photo of Ian McLagan and Keith Moon, and in a hat there, that is Tony Sanchez. And the bottom row there, second from the left, is Anita Pallenberg, Ronnie Wood, and Chrissy Wood. And then nearly at the end there, just before the shoe, we've got Paul and Linda McCartney. Later into 1974, we've got the arrival of a Sex Pistol, although he wasn't a Sex Pistol just yet. He was I don't know what he was then. He was either a Strand or a Swanker. Because the band he was in, Steve Jones we're talking about here, the bands that Steve Jones was in before the Sex Pistols were the Strand, because they were the band, all of his all the guys in that band were huge Roxy Music fans, and then Swankers, which I think was a Malcolm McLaren name. But anyway, Steve Jones and a lot of his mates, not necessarily Sex Pistol mates, but his actual mates around Hammersmith, they were huge Ronnie Wood and Faces fans, and they used to get in a van and just drive from Hammersmith up to Richmond and hang around, park the van outside and hope to see Ronnie. And Ronnie would occasionally come out and wave, and some of the other guys that were in the house as well. Now, as Steve Jones said in his book, Lonely Boy, any normal fan would have just left it there, but he said, there was a little lane that went down the side of the house, and before I knew it, I was in the cottage stealing things. And he took a little portable TV and a jacket that he assumed belonged to Keith Richards at the time. But he said, years later, I saw a photo in a magazine of Mick Jagger wearing it, so Keith had probably just nicked it off him anyway. And he said it was almost like he was carrying on a tradition. Now I've got another solo album for Ronnie. It's Now Look, it's called, and it kind of features a lot of the names that we're already familiar with from the first solo album. We do have one new face though, and that is the American singer-songwriter Bobby Womack. Then we've got a big decision for Ronnie. What's happened is that Mick Taylor had quit, the Rolling Stones guitarist, had quit the band in December 1974, and the Rolling Stones are looking for a replacement. They're looking to recruit, and his name is on the list. Probably the one, probably first on the list, Ronnie Wood's name, but it was quite a list, depending on, I think the list has grown as the years have gone by. The list that I'm going to go through now may be a lot bigger than the one that the Stones had originally. But anyway, let's have a look. We've got Wayne Perkins, he's the American session player. He was one of the serious ones, I think, and he'd played with everybody from Leon Russell to Bob Marley. Ronnie Wood, he was the guy to beat. And then a few more. Well, Jeff Beck, too good, apparently. Eric Clapton, too successful at the time. Harvey Mandel was a serious one. He was an American session player, but had played over here with John Mayall. They really liked him, auditioned him quite a few times, and in fact they used him on they went on to use him later on their Black and Blue album for a couple of songs. Peter Frampton, he was on the list as well. Peter Frampton, according to Bill Wyman in his book though, was just too good looking. Steve Marriott, too much personality. Mick Ronson, I don't know what happened with Mick Ronson. I did see him on a list somewhere. Don't know why he didn't happen, but he didn't. Rory Gallagher, he was probably the most serious of all of them. What happened was, well, it was Ian Stewart, the Rolling Stones road manager, that got in touch with Rory in Ireland and said, look, Keith really wants you to jam with the Stones. So Rory went over to Rotterdam, and Rory was around with the Stones for about 3 or 4 days, but the problem was Rory had a Japanese tour to go to, and he did the Japan tour. By the time he got back, his name had fizzled out, but Keith Richards was really keen on Rory, and in fact at one point Keith Richards, in an interview in the NME, which is a British music paper, said it's either Peter Tosh or Rory Gallagher, and that's it. So that's how keen Keith was at the time. Andy Summers, who had been he'd been teaching guitar on the west coast of America for quite a while now, after stints with Soft Machine first, and then the Animals. And he said in his book, Next Train or Last Train, actually I can't remember what it's called, but a great book though. Andy, if you're watching, he said in his book that he got back and there was a headline, and I think it was the Melody Maker, saying Andy Summers, possible new Stones guitarist. He went off, of course, he went off to be in the Police. Nils Lofgren's name wasn't around for very long. Keith Richards, not keen apparently. And then Steve Hillage, that would be the name on everybody's lips if they were looking for a replacement guitarist. And I've got no idea why that one didn't stick around. So, no big surprise, Ronnie Wood got the job. Ronnie Wood, though, is pretty confident that he can be in the Rolling Stones and stay in the Faces, keep that going as well. Rod Stewart was a lot less confident that might happen, and so that was the end of the Faces. And this is the Rolling Stones lineup for nearly 20 years, from 1975 to 93. Charlie Watts, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Ronnie Wood. Bill Wyman ended up quitting the Stones in around about 1990, but it wasn't announced till 1993. And that's it, rock and roll wise, apart from one kind of rock and roller, but we've got to wait a while. We've got to wait around 20 years. It was in 1996 that Pete Townsend was looking for somewhere new to live. He was having marriage problems, and he lived at the time in Chapel House, which had once been owned by the British poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. But he was looking for somewhere new to go, and he was out with an agent in a little village nearby called Petersham. And the agent said, "Look, I don't know why you haven't thought about buying the Wick." And Pete Townsend said, "I didn't know it was available." So the agent said, "Well, it is." And Pete said, "Well, I'll buy it." And the agent said, "Well, don't you want to view it?" Pete said, "No, that's it." Pete bought it in 1996 and couldn't believe his luck when he went into the basement And there was Ronnie Wood's recording studio, still pretty intact. Win-win for Pete Townshend. And finally, yes fans, it's roundabout time. I hope you think that the wait has been worthwhile. I'm pretty confident on this one. It's a great round. Well, it's not even one roundabout, it's two. Let's take a look. You really can't argue with roundabouts like this. Two. We've got a double here. We're talking like topographic oceans territory. That's what's going on here. Both around about 4 feet across. Clear exits all the way around. Lovely building on the right there, a Star and Garter, big old factory. We're close to the edge of Richmond Park at the back there. I'm going to go really strong on this. I don't think I can't see it. I can't see it getting beat this roundabout. I mean, I'm going to go really. I mean, I need to leave a bit of room, so I'm going to give it 93%. But if it gets beat, I'll be as surprised as you. So if you go from the Wick over both of these roundabouts, keep going. You're in Richmond Park, and if you're in Richmond Park, well, why not?